Hi everybody, we are getting closer to the end. 3 chapters today. The plan, capture, and feeding time. So remember, if you think about when we left off, a plan was being made, and here's your vocabulary for today. Gotta get it. So we have presume, which means to take for granted that something exists. Lunatic, an extremely foolish or eccentric person. Throttle, that may sound familiar to some of you. It's a device controlling the flow of fuel or power to an engine. An errand is a short journey taken in order to deliver or collect something. And spectators, a person or people who watches at a show, a game, or another event. So we have to presume something. Someone's being a lunatic. There's a throttle. That's obviously there's fuel or power to an engine, so someone's moving. An errand, someone's going out on an errand to do something, and there's going to be spectators. Let's dive in and see what's happening. The plan. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. Sophie was still in her seat, and the BFG was still high up on his crazy perch. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men. "I knew there was something like this going on, Your Majesty," the head of the army said. "For the last 10 years, we have been getting reports from nearly every country in the world about people disappearing mysteriously in the night. We had one only the other day from Panama." "For the hatty taste," cried the BFG. "And one from Wellington in New Zealand," said the head of the army. "For the booty flavor," cried the BFG. "What is he talking about?" the head of the Air Force asked. "Work it out for yourself," the Queen said. "What time is it? 10 a.m. In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. They have to be stopped. We must act fast." "We'll bomb the blighters," shouted the head of the Air Force. "We'll mow them down with machine guns," cried the head of the army. "I do not approve of any of that," the Queen said. "But they're doing horrible things themselves," cried the head of the army. "That is no reason why we should follow their example," the Queen said. "2 wrongs don't make a right." "And 2 rights don't make a left," cried the BFG. "We must bring them back alive," the Queen said. "How?" the 2 military men said together. "They are all 50 feet high. They'd knock us down like 9-pins. "Wait," cried the BFG. "Hold your horseflies. Keep your skirts on. I think I has the answer to the maiden's hair." "Let him speak," the Queen said. "Every afternoon," the BFG said, "all these giants in the land of Noddy." "I can't understand a word this feller says," the head of the army snapped. "Why doesn't he speak clearly?" He means the land of Nod," Sophie said. "It's pretty obvious." "Exunkly," cried the BFG. "Every afternoon all these 9 giants is lying on the ground, snoozing away in a very deep sleep. They is always resting like that before they is galloping off to guzzle another helping of human beings." "Go on," they said. "So what?" "So what the soldier has to do is creep up to the giants while they is still in the land of Noddy and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and junky chains." "Brilliant," said the Queen. "That's all very well," said the head of the army, "but how do we get the brutes back here? We can't load 50-foot giants onto trucks." "Shoot 'em on the spot, that's what I say." The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said, this time to the head of the Air Force, "You is having belly boppers, is you not?" "Is he being rude?" the head of the Air Force said. "He means helicopters," Sophie told him. "Then why doesn't he say so? Of course we have helicopters." "Whoopsie big belly boppers?" asked the BFG. "Very big ones," the head of the Air Force said proudly. "But no helicopter is big enough to get a giant like that inside it." "You do not put him inside," the BFG said. "You sling him underneath the belly of your belly bopper and carry him like a portito." "Like a what?" said the head of the Air Force. "Like a torpedo," Sophie said. "Could you do that, Air Marshal?" the Queen asked. "Well, I suppose we could," the head of the Air Force admitted grudgingly. "Then get cracking," the Queen said. "You'll need 9 helicopters, 1 for each giant." "Where is this place?" the Air Force man said to the BFG. "I presume you cannot pinpoint it on a map." "Pinpoint," said the BFG. "Map? I was never hearing these words before. Is this Air Force bean talking slush bungle?" The Air Force Marshal's face turned the color of a ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking slush bungle. The Queen, with her usual admirable tact and good sense, came to the rescue. BFG, she said, can you tell us more or less where this giant country is? No, Magister, the BFG says, not a my Nelly. Then we're jiggered, cried the Army General. This is ridiculous, cried the Air Marshal. You must not be giving up so easy, the BFG said calmly. The first titchy bobstickle you met and you begin shouting, you is Biff Squiggled. The Army General was no more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began to swell with fury and his cheeks blew out until they looked like two huge ripe tomatoes. Your Majesty, he cried, we are dealing with a lunatic. I want nothing more to do with this ridiculous operation. The Queen, who was used to the tantrums of her senior officials, ignored him completely. BFG, she said, would you please tell these rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do? A pleasure, Magister, said the BFG. Now listen to me careful, you two boot bogglers. The military men began to twitch, but they stayed put. I is not having the foggiest idea where giant country is in the world, the BFG said. But I is always able to gallop there. I is galloping forwards and backwards from giant country every night to blow my dreams into little Chidler's bedrooms. I is knowing the way very well. So all you is having to do is this. Put your 9 big belly boppers up in the air and let them follow me as I gallop along. How long will the journey take? The Queen asked. If we is leaving now, the BFG said, we will be arriving just as the giants is having their afternoon snoozle. Splendid, said the Queen. Then turning to the 2 military men, she said, prepare to leave immediately. The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed by the whole business, said, that is all very well, Your Majesty, but what are we going to do with the blighters once we've got them back? Don't you worry about that, the Queen told him. We'll be ready for them. Hurry up now. Off you go. If it pleases Your Majesty, Sophie said, I should like to ride with the BFG to keep him company. Where will you sit? Asked the Queen. In his ear, Sophie said. Show them, BFG. The BFG got down from his high chair. He picked Sophie up with his fingers. He swiveled his huge right ear until it was parallel with the ground. Then he placed Sophie gently inside. The heads of the Army and the Air Force stood there goggling. The Queen smiled. You really are rather a wonderful giant, she said. Magister, the BFG said, I is wishing to ask a very special thing from you. What is it? The Queen said. Could I please bring back here in the belly boppers all my collection of dreams? They is taking me years and years to collect. I is not wanting to lose them. Why, of course, the Queen said. I wish you a safe journey. All right, it's time for the capture. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from giant country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this. With 9 huge helicopters roaring along just over his head, he had never before traveled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to. But this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isle to the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and then, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses, crouching in the giant's ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marveled at the giant's speed and the way he leapt across wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. Be careful to hang on tight, the BFG said. We is going fast as a fizzle crump. The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip, and jumper, with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then, they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring at the atlas. And then he'd stare at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. Where the devil are we going? He cried. I haven't the foggiest idea, the pilot answered. The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing. The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy mustache. He was very proud of his mustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. "It's fun going to new places," he said. "New places," shouted the head of the Air Force. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "This place we're flying over isn't in the atlas, is it?" the pilot said, grinning. "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clear off the last page." Girls and boys, an atlas is a book filled with maps and talks about where the places are. When you get to the end of the atlas, there's always blank pages. I think they're there so you can keep track of other places you may have visited. So they don't know. You can't track it on a map. "I expect the old giant knows where he's going," the young pilot said. "He's leading us to disaster," cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the Army, who was even more terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas," he cried, leaning forward to look. "It's exactly what I am telling you," cried the Air Force man. "Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago." He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. "So now we must be somewhere here," he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. "Where's here?" cried the head of the Army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "That's why the atlas put 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself." Kind of what I thought too. The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this godforsaken desert," he cried. "All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue." "What do we know about that? Are they getting closer? You should know those details." "The giant has stopped," the young pilot said. "He's waving us down." The pilots throttled back the engines, and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, 1 from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any of the giants," the head of the Army said. "The giants is all just out of sight over there," the BFG told them. "But if you is taking these slosh-bucking noisy belly boppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once." Excuse me. "And then, pop, goes the weasel." "So you want us to proceed by jeep?" the head of the Army said. "Yes," the BFG said. "But you all must be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery jokery." The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the Army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns," he cried. "There is a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of here." "Pig spiffle," the BFG said. "Those noises are not guns." "Of course they're guns," shouted the head of the Army. "I'm a military man, and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back." "Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep," the BFG said. "I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snortle when I is hearing one." "Are you quite sure?" the Army man said anxiously. "Positive," the BFG said. "Proceed cautiously," the Army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. What are they seeing? Even at the distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw that what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in the battle. The BFG raised his hand. The jeep stopped. The soldiers got out. "What happens if one of them wakes up?" whispered the head of the Army, his knees knocking together from fear. "If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say knackjife," the BFG answered, grinning hugely. "Me is the only one that won't be gobbled up because giants is never eating giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones because I is hiding her if that happens." The head of the Army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. "Go forward, men," the head of the Army said. "Go forward and do your duty bravely." The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. No one dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood near by watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Can you picture that? His arm stuck behind him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny, piggy black eyes. "Which of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, you rotsome man-hugger?" Suddenly he saw the soldiers. In a flash he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. He's getting out of there. "Human beings!" the flesh lump eater yelled. "What is all you flush-bunking, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country?" He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up with his hand. "I is having early suppers today," he shouted, holding the poor, squirmy soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror-struck. "Do something," she cried. "Quick, before he eats him." "Put that human being down," the BFG cried. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG. "What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets?" he bellowed. "You is making me very suspicious." The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm and onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the queen had pinned on her chest. Quickly, she undid it. "I is guzzling you nice and slow," the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. "Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You is not getting away from me because I is galloping 50 times faster than you." Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. Then, when she was right up close to the great naked hairy leg, she rammed the 3-inch long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "You is bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome poisonous viper. It was a dreadly dungerous vinscreen viper." "Save our souls!" bellowed the flesh lump eater. "Sound the crumpets! I is bitten by the spestuous venomous vinscreen viper." He flopped to the ground and sat there, howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. "The teeth of the deadly viper is still sticking into me," he yelled. "I is feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet." The BFG saw his second chance. "We must be getting those viper teeth out at once," he cried. "Otherwise you is deader than duck soup. I is helping you." The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "That will stop the poisonous juices from the venomous viper going up your leg and into your heart." The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. "Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the venomous viper," the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot. "I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. "Do it quickly," shouted the flesh lump eater, "before I is fizzing to death." "There we is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. "Well done, you," Sophie cried. "Well done, you," said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "You is saving all of our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back to me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during the schmoozle. When you was only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you was sleeping extra doubly deep, the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeeps. Her Majesty will be very pleased with me, the head of the Army said. I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move? Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams, the BFG said. We can't waste time with that rubbish, the Army General said. It is the Queen's order, Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. What errand do you think they went on? What's that you got there? The head of the Army demanded to know. Curiosity is killing the rat, the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, Now he is driving back to the belly boppers and picking up the frightsome giants. The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, and onto the helicopters. So there they are. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from the ropes and chains. I is flush-bunked, roared the flesh lump eater. I is spitz-wiggled, yelled the child chewer. I is swog-swalloped, bellowed the bone cruncher. I is goose-gruggled, howled the man-hugger. I is gung-zwibbled, shouted the meat dripper. I is flunk-gungled, screamed the maid-masher. I is slop-groggled, squawked the gizzard gobbler. I is crod-squinkled, yowled the blood bottler. I is bop-muggered, screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hoisters with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giants' chains, one hook near the legs, the other near the arms. Then very slowly the giants were winced up into the air parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them on the galloping giant so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. So now we're at another day. We're in today. So she was kidnapped the next night to the Queen. Now the next night. Feeding time. While the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilized to dig the colossal hole in which the 9 giants were to be permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines worked ceaselessly through the night under powerful arc lights, and a massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular, and engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if all 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the topmost giant will still be some 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered to the floor, but they were still trussed up, and now came the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down and do this, because the moment the giant is freed, he would be sure to turn on the wretched person who had freed him and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer. I has told you before, he said, giants is never eating giants. So I is going down, and I shall untie them myself before you can say Rack Jobinson. With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peeping down into the pit, the BFG was lowered on a rope. One by one, he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in fury. Why is they putting us down here in this grob sledging hole? They shouted at the BFG. Because you is guzzling human beings, the BFG answered. I is always warning you not to do it, and you is never taking the titchiest bit of notice. In that case, the Flesh Lumpeter bellowed, I think we is guzzling you instead. The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he had brought back with him from Giant Country lay at the top of the pit. What's in there? The Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a giant black and white striped object the size of a man. What is it, girls and boys? Schnozcumbers, he cried. This is the repulsant Schnozcumber, Magister, and that is all we is going to give these disgustive giants from now on. May I taste it? The Queen asked. Don't, Magister, don't, cried the BFG. It is tasting of trog filth and pig squibble. With that, he tossed the Schnozcumber down to the giants below. There's your supper, he shouted. Have a munch on that. He fished out more Schnozcumber from the sack and threw them down. The giants below howled and cursed. The BFG laughed. It serves them right, left, and center, he said. What will we feed them on when the Schnozcumbers are all used up? The Queen asked. They is never being used up, your Magister, the BFG answered, smiling. I is also bringing in this sack a whole bungle of Schnozcumber plants, which I is giving, with your permission, to the royal gardener to put in the soil. Then we is having an everlasting supply of this repulsant food to feed these thirst-bloody giants on. What a clever fellow you are, the Queen said. You are not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool. I can see that. So that's where we stop for today. So the BFG's plan, working out, Sophie helping him out. You know, he may not speak clearly that everyone can understand him, but he had a plan. Girls and boys, it's always good, no matter what you're doing, starting a math problem, reading, learning to tie your shoes, whatever it is, to try something new, you need a plan. So they came up with a plan, they stuck with the plan, and now they're in the hole. And the chapter I'm going to read for you tomorrow is called The Author, and I purposely kept this one separate because it kind of brings the story together a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more. This will be talking more about Roald Dahl. Where's his name on here? Roald Dahl here as the author, and sort of what his purpose was for the book. Because sometimes, you know, the author has a little piece of hiding, like hiding a little trait of theirs maybe, kind of bringing the story together. So, one more chapter to go with the BFG. See you next time.